With Japan now a global baseball power, the history of its rise takes on a more special meaning. Ironically, the centerpiece of this page in world history is a man whose baseball roots we know all too familiar.
Well,
there's absolutely no doubt about that. When he came to Japan, certainly his presence, what he did for Japan, he was really the, so to speak, the pioneer, the starting point of the popularity of baseball. You can even call it the origin of baseball in Japan.
Robert Fitz is an award-winning author and researcher in both baseball and Japanese history. His most recent book, Bonsai Babe, details the 1934 American All-Star Team tour of Japan, led by Babe Ruth.
The 31 and 34 Major League tours were the idea of Matsutaro Shiriki, the owner of the Yomiuri newspaper. And he came up with the idea of bringing over American Major League teams, especially Babe Ruth, and then covering this team in his newspaper to increase sales. And originally they tried in 1929 and 1930, and it didn't work. Babe Ruth wasn't available. Finally, it looked like 1931 was going to work. And another American was planning to bring over a team anyway. So they teamed up to bring over an all-star team in 31, but they couldn't get Babe Ruth. So it took a couple of years, but they finally got Ruth to commit, and in 34, the All-American team with Babe Ruth came. The night before the All-Americans left North America, Connie Mack brought them together in the Vancouver hotel room and read an open letter written by the Commissioner of Baseball, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, to the players. And this letter said, "You will be more than baseball players. You will be ambassadors representing Major League Baseball and your country. We expect you to behave like professionals, like gentlemen, and to teach the Japanese ball players and to help the friendship between our two nations." So when they go to Japan, they know they are diplomats. They know that their mission is more than to win baseball games. It's to teach the game of baseball to the Japanese players and to win over the hearts of the fans. When Babe Ruth showed up in Japan in 1934, he had just finished the worst season of his career. Although his numbers still looked good for the average mortal, he had the fewest number of home runs since he was a full-time pitcher. He had the lowest batting average since he was a full-time pitcher. And his knees were shot, he was overweight, and the Yankees were ready to get rid of him. He was the highest paid baseball player by far, and they said, all right, he's still Babe Ruth, but he's not worth the money anymore. First of all, the American team comes into Yokohama on a steamer, and there's tens of thousands of people on the pier to welcome them. After they take a train to Tokyo, there's 500,000 people in the vicinity of the train station. They managed to get through this crowd and into open limousines for the several mile trip from their station, Tokyo Station, to their hotel. And there's 500,000 fans, sometimes 20 or 30 deep, lining these streets as they go through. And the traffic got so bad, streetcars were forced to stop because people were blocking the tracks. This is perhaps one of the greatest baseball parades in the history of the game. Babe Ruth said for decades this was one of his favorite moments of his life. So he shows up in Japan and he's overweight, he's depressed, he doesn't know what's going to happen. But the Japanese fans are going crazy and Babe Ruth loves attention. And his bat responded. He ended up hitting over 400. He was the leading hitter in the entire tournament. He hit more home runs than any other player by far. He led the tournament in RBIs, in runs scored. In every single offensive category, Babe Ruth was the leader by far. And remember, the other players are Lou Gehrig, Jimmy Fox, Charlie Gehringer, Lefty O'Doul, some of the top players in the Major League. The All-Americans stayed in Japan from November 2nd to December 2nd. They played 18 games. Most of those games were against a team called All Nippon, which was an amateur Japanese all-star team. They did play a couple of inter-squad games as well. And for most games, the Americans won comfortably. But there were two in the middle of the series where the Japanese nearly won. In one of the games, it was November 20th, 1934, a very important date in Japanese baseball history. A young pitcher named Eiji Sawamura. He was just 17 years old, and a few months earlier had been playing high school baseball. And he pitched a game where he pitched a no-hitter against the All-Americans for 5 innings until Ruth finally got a single to break it up. And he pitched a shutout until the 7th inning when Lou Gehrig hit a home run. And he ended up losing the game only 1-0, but that made him a national hero and showed the potential the Japanese players had.
He did good against Babe Ruth. He struck out Babe Ruth, and then, people started to paying attention to him.
And after the game that Eiji Sawamura had pitched against and nearly won, Connie Mack actually approached Sawamura and offered him a chance to play in the United States. He said Sawamura thought about it for very little time. He was 17, he was still living at home with his parents, he only spoke Japanese, and he said, no, thank you. This is my home, I want to stay here. And he did. So their time in Japan is spent not only playing baseball, but going to banquets, shaking hands of both Americans and Japanese, signing autographs. Babe Ruth estimated he signed about 4 dozen baseballs every day he was in Japan. And Babe's image went all over newspapers, over magazines. Baseball cards were printed up for the event. He was such a superstar that the ambassador to Japan, Joseph Grew, wrote back to the United States saying, when he was here, there were 2 ambassadors. There was Babe Ruth and I, because Babe Ruth did more to bring the countries together than I ever could. And in December of 1934, soon after the All-American team left, they officially brought together the All-Nippon team and formed the Tokyo Yomiuri Giants and offered contracts to most of the players who played on this all-star team. When Babe Ruth left in December 1934, there were articles both in Japan and especially in the United States talking about the Babe Ruth's value as a diplomat, how Babe Ruth had stopped any potential conflict between Japan and the United States. But when Pearl Harbor happened, Babe Ruth was shocked because he still believed that somehow his visit to Japan had forestalled any possible conflict. The next day he goes out and he starts joining the war effort, and he becomes a spokesman for the Red Cross for war bonds in an effort to defeat the Japanese, who he feels personally betrayed by. Later on, there's a very famous article in the New York Times where a group of Japanese charged to their deaths by yelling, "To hell with Babe Ruth." And that did happen, by the way. But at the end of the war, when Babe Ruth Day was declared in the major league parks to honor Babe Ruth, the Japanese followed suit, and they had Babe Ruth there. And Babe Ruth's images, once again, were all over Japan. And you can see him on baseball cards from 1948, 1949. You can see him on magazines. Biographies of Babe Ruth written in Japanese start coming out. And he once again becomes the hero that he was in 1934.
Babe Ruth's month-long journey in Japan in 1934 left an indelible mark on a nation and launched a new baseball power.
Babe Ruth opened up Japanese people's eyes, oh, hey, we love baseball already. Baseball is huge here already, but we are not the top of the world at all. We need to be more better to compete, these guys. He built up Japanese professional baseball league because before their visit, there wasn't any Japanese professional baseball league.
His image is enshrined throughout the country, and his visit remains a seminal moment in Japanese history.
People who doesn't know about baseball at all, like my grandma, but she knew Babe Ruth's name. His name is in a school textbook, and so all kids know the Babe Ruth's name. So people still really, appreciate, people still really appreciate, what Babe Ruth's done over there, and of course, what Babe Ruth's done into the world, what Babe Ruth's done to, down to Japanese baseball. Baseball is not just a sport to Japanese people. It's a very, baseball always giving Japanese people hope and dreams, and it's a great thing.